I've not been given notice that he's not coming, so I'm going to count on him being here. My name is Kevin Fogg. I'm a lecturer in the Faculty of History in Oxford University and a fellow at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. And it's sort of exciting to get to welcome y'all to the first panel of the symposium. So thanks for making it out of bed. Thanks for making it all the way here for those of you who come from quite far. The way that we'll run this panel is to give each speaker 15 minutes to present and about 5 minutes of questions right after that presentation. Lord willing, this will give us some minutes to do questions all together at the very end so that we can think about being in consonance with one another. Shall I hand it over to our first speaker so that we take advantage of time? And Lord willing, Thomas Bruce will be joining us before we run out. So Darlene Espana is a PhD candidate in history at the Nanyang Technological University of Singapore, where she looks at film, politics, and the Cold War. Darlene, I hand it over to you.
I actually prepared for a 20-minute presentation, by the way. Anyway, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, everyone, for attending this panel. Today, I will be sharing with you some of the fundamental aspects of my paper entitled Screening the Evils of Southeast Asian History, a 21st Century Remembrance Through Films. Let me begin with a story. I'm a historian, so I love stories. A few years ago, I went to a free screening of a classic 1946 Mexican film entitled Enamorada, A Woman in Love. It was in Singapore, and the room was filled with mostly Latinos, mostly Mexicans. There were some Asians, some Westerners, but really majority of the audience were Mexicans. And at that point, I wondered how a Mexican living in Singapore would react to a classic movie from home, created almost 6 decades ago. I got my answer when halfway through the film, the Mexican woman seated beside me started to sing along with one of the characters in the film to the religious composition Ave Maria. She was singing really loudly now. The song probably lasted for a good minute or two, and she was so captivated, she was so into the music that she was singing and crying at the same time. It was so strange. When the music ended, she gesticulated to make the sign of the cross. At that precise moment, I realized, perhaps with even more clarity than before, how absorbing and captivating films can be. She was watching a movie that reminded her of home, and the features of it, no matter how obscure, ancillary. But more importantly, she was prompted to act, to sing a song that meant something to her, and then to make the sign of the cross, thus physically expressing her religious beliefs. That experience triggered more questions in me. What do we really see when we watch films? What do films tell us about ourselves, our memories, our past, our societies in general? Now, in this particular paper, which actually remains a work in progress, I examine how contemporary films remember and portray the lingering historical evils in the memories and narratives of Southeast Asia. More specifically, I use Joshua Oppenheimer's film entitled An Act of Killing to examine Indonesia's communist purge in 1965. And I also used Gerald Tarog's blockbuster film entitled General Luna, Nation or Self, to examine the remnants of colonialism in the Philippines. So really here I focus on 2 countries in Southeast Asia, Philippines and Indonesia. My main argument is quite actually straightforward. I argue that film serves as a crucial platform for coming to terms with the evils from the past. I further argue that evil in today's milieu is neither homogeneous nor monotonous. It is represented in a spectrum of images in varying degrees of evilness. Okay? Now, let me jump very quickly to the case of Indonesia. In 1965, the Indonesian Communist Purge transpired. Followers of the communist group PKI, including members of the ethnic Chinese minority, were blamed for the failed left-wing coup. The coup was immediately crushed by the military, but what followed was a nebulous episode of the military tracking down, torturing, and killing members, suspected members, or even just sympathizers of the PKI. Up until today, this brief juncture in Indonesian history remains unclear. We do not know the exact number of people who died. Many individuals just went missing without their families knowing what exactly happened to them. It is not even clear whether the PKI was the one responsible for the failed coup. Simply put, there are so many questions that remain unanswered concerning that turbulent period. Now, the film An Act of Killing explores the recollections of those who were directly involved in the killings. At the center of the narrative is an Indonesian guy named Anwar Congo, an old man who was ostensibly hired by the military to identify and kill suspected communists in North Sumatra. He and his gang were responsible for extorting money, were also responsible for extorting money from many ethnic Chinese to spare them from the genocide. Personally, Anwar is said to have killed around 1,000 people. One guy apparently killed 1,000 Indonesians just in a year's time. In the film, Anwar vividly recounts his activities during the purge. For example, he explains that they used various means of torture, from beatings to strangulation using wire. He demonstrates his position and style in killing as if he was retelling a comic story. He wears brightly colored clothes. He rides a funky yellow Jeep-type car. He exudes this good-natured smile, and he was very charming. Throughout the film, he was affable and charming, which was a stark contrast to his revelations concerning his actions during the purge. He was killing people, and yet throughout the film, he was smiling. Okay? Now, I don't have really enough time to discuss the whole details of the film, but let me just state that a close look at this particular movie reveals three fundamental aspects about how the present Indonesian society recollects this sordid event in the past. First of all, the perpetrators, or the killing squad, were represented in a spectrum of images. You have the image of the repentant killer, the one who right now recalls his actions and actually feels guilty. For example, Anwar's friend was interviewed, and he said, and he, like Anwar, he killed many Indonesians. He killed many Chinese, and he said he was feeling guilty, and he said, the communists were not the cruel ones. We were the cruel ones. And then you also have the image of the proud killer, the unabashed evil, okay, who was represented by these guys who up until now believed that what they did during the communist purge were legitimate. They had to kill, and so they were proud of killing. They were doing that for Indonesia, for the unification of Indonesia. There was also the image of the killer, or the one who was directly involved in the killings but pretended not to be. Okay? Someone who tend to forget, or appears that he forgot what he did. Let me explain this a little bit further. There was one journalist who, again, was portrayed in the film, and he said, I had no idea of the killings. But interestingly, he worked in a building where the rooftop was used by Anwar and his gang to kill communists or suspected communists day in and day out. And the guy said, I had no idea. So he pretended either he forgot or he did not know, or he pretends that he doesn't know. Okay? But more interestingly, what I found quite compelling in this particular film is that the killer actually was portrayed in a sort of schizophrenic way. What do I mean by this? In one scene, a killer can be guilty. He would feel guilty of what he did. And then in another scene, he would be proud of what he did. For example, Anwar, he's got changing attitudes. Simplemente, he's got changing attitudes concerning what he did. For example, throughout the film, Anwar was very proud of doing his responsibility for Indonesia and killing the enemies of the state, the communists. But then towards the end, he went back to the building, to the rooftop, where he killed a lot of people, a lot of suspected communists, and then he appeared nauseous. He appeared weak, indicating that somehow he was feeling the heaviness, somehow he was feeling the guilt of what he did. Now, in this respect, the film reveals that even the perpetrators have not been able to come to terms with their actions during the purge. Perhaps even what they did remains, ambiguous for them. Now, secondly, the film also shows that even among or within the clique of perpetrators or killers, division based on class remains evident. The film captures the luxurious life of the leaders, of the perpetrators, and yet Anwar and his friends were depicted as middle class or low class people. For instance, one of the leaders of Pemuda Panchasila, Yapto, was portrayed in the film as playing golf in a really posh place. And then the next scene that followed was Anwar, who, like Yapto, also was a killer, a member of the killing squad during the purge, but he wasn't playing golf, he was playing bowling. He was bowling in a really shabby, really dirty place. So really, even if they can be considered as victors, not everyone really managed to enjoy the spoils of the war. Some killers went to become political leaders. Some killers went to live a really ordinary, mundane life, like the protagonist of the film, Anwar. Okay? The evil still lingers. Third aspect that I saw in this particular film is that the continuing presence of evil in Indonesian society. Okay? For example, in one scene, the members of Pemuda Panchasila were organizing a sort of party among the organization members. And they went to 3 stores owned by Indonesian Chinese, and they asked for money. There was one Chinese guy who gave him a couple of bills, and the member of the Pemuda Panchasila said, no, this is not enough. He was extorting money from that Indonesian Chinese. And so immediately what I realized is that, despite the years that have passed, the evil continued in the present society. Okay? And the film inherently, interestingly, unveils that staggering reality that the Indonesian society has not come to terms with its traumatic past. The ones who committed the crimes were not punished for their actions. They remain as important political figures. The oppression continues, but now without the cloak of communism. Okay? And finally, the same ideology, Panchasila, which embodies Pemuda Panchasila, actually that motivated and shaped the purge, remains a crucial rallying point. That ideology that pushed a lot of Indonesians to kill fellow Indonesians remains sort of an important ideology that holds the heterogeneous nation of Indonesia together. Now, I only have 3 minutes, and I still need to discuss the film on the Philippines. Let me just make things simple. All right. I don't know how to make things simple.
Take your time.
Right.
I'm not sure if our 4th speaker's in, so take your
Okay,
time.
perfect. There you go. I love you. All right. Now, let me go very, very quickly to the case of the Philippines. One of the most turbulent period in the country's history occurred from 1898 to 1902. Okay? This was the height of the Philippine Revolution, and the Philippines was sucked into the Spanish-American War. In essence, during this particular time, just a few years, the Philippines saw itself entangled into 2 fronts of war. One, we were fighting the Spaniards, who were still in the capital and did not want to leave the Philippines. And yet, you also have the Americans, okay, in Manila Bay and wanting to occupy the Philippines. Now, it was this context, okay, from 1898 to 1902, that this film, the film that I'm examining, is actually based. Using both historical facts and fiction, the director of the film, General Luna, this is Gerald Taron, interrogates the blunders and the horrors of colonialism and revolution in the Philippines. More importantly, this film attempts to reconstruct and to really put forward the sordid realities that hampered the country's independence campaign. Okay? In a close look, and this one I'll be very quick, this film depicts evil in Philippine history into 3 phases. Okay? The first refers to the Americans, okay? The Americans as evils. They were portrayed as liars, as hypocrites who deceived the Filipinos. They pretended to leave the Philippines, okay, once the Spaniards were ousted, and yet they chose to remain. In one scene, an American officer said to his battalion, who just came from the US, men, okay, welcome to the Philippines. She's ours. That's what the American guy said. Okay? The second phase of evil in this particular film is actually depicted by Filipino economic elites, represented by two characters named Felipe Buencamino and Frederick Paterno, who kept pushing the Philippine government, headed by Aguinaldo, to negotiate with the Americans and take into consideration the commercial and economic advantages of accepting the Americans. They did not want to fight. They wanted to accept American tutelage. In his fit of rage, the protagonist in this film, General Luna, he shouted. He was so fierce and he was so arrogant. And he said, "Business or freedom? Nation or self? You must choose." Okay? This dynamics, this sort of problem, really reveals the ensuing class struggle of the economic elites trying to grapple and trying to control, governance and politics in the Philippines. The last one, interestingly, the third evil, okay, pertains to the fractures within Philippine society itself. In particular, the social and cultural predilections embodied in the regionalist thinking and lack of discipline of the Filipinos. Okay, so Philippines as evils themselves. The film clearly points out the fact that the revolution, our revolution, failed because the Philippine society was not unified, or worse, we were indolent and naive. On the one hand, a lot of the soldiers did not want to obey this general, okay, simply because he was a native of a different province. Okay. On another hand, a lot of Filipino soldiers abandoned their trenches and abandoned their responsibilities and just basically slept with several women. So we were that irresponsible. At this juncture, I would like to point out that the protagonist himself, General Luna, epitomizes the contradictions, fractures, and defects really of the Philippine society. The director, although he acknowledges Luna's ideas on military tactics and politics, also exposes these guys' blemishes and scars. Okay? He was arrogant. The protagonist was a Filipino general, was arrogant, he was hot-headed, he was bordering manic, he was psychotic in a sense. In one scene, he almost killed an innocent peddler because he couldn't control his rage. Okay? He was also a womanizer, and he was married, but he had several affairs with several women. So he was a valiant general, and yet quite very human with his scars and blemishes. Let me just really end this by really saying what this particular film tells us about the Philippine society. In essence, the director pushes Filipinos to re-examine the self, okay, and to move away from a sort of conservative, traditional nationalist thinking and of interpreting colonialism. The director excellently points out the fact that the Philippines' failure, okay, throughout history, failure to acquire independence immediately by 1898, was not only because of the Americans, was not even because the Spaniards sold us to the U.S., but inherently it's because of the evils within the Philippine society, evils that I argue remain, evils that I argue linger, okay, and then something that we should try to come to terms with. And with that, I end my presentation. Thank you so much.
Let me ask, has Thomas Bruce snuck in that I didn't see? No? Okay, this means that we do have some time for questions. So I hand it over to you to field those.
Yes.
I think you said at one stage, did you not? I just want to clarify this, that today the Indonesians are still extorting money from Chinese?
Indeed.
Today?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
The other thing I was going to say is that my understanding is that during, in 65, one of the reasons so many people were killed is because it was a very convenient way to get rid of a debt. The Malays were killing the Chinese so that they could just, because they owed them money, so this is a good excuse to wipe it up. I think that's why it was as much as it was.
That's a very
Well, it
interesting.
helped.
It helped. That's a very interesting point regarding the debt. Can I just point out, one of the things that the killers, at least in the film, how they justified killing the ethnic Chinese. They said just a context. Anwar and his gang were scalpers. They were selling Hollywood movie tickets to the Indonesian society. That's their main bread and butter. And they said they hated the Chinese, especially the communist Chinese, because they did not want to watch Hollywood films. They were against American any cultural product. And so they lost their bread and butter, and they said instead, and so they were pushed to become members of the killing squad for money. That's what they said. Okay? These Chinese did not want to watch films. They don't have money, and we had to fill our bellies. That's what they said. So they became killing squads. Surely, see, that's the point. Surely there are so many reasons, factors that drove that massive genocide, but up until now we only know bits and pieces of it. Okay? And then indeed the extortion still happens. The extortion still happens. And these are Indonesian Chinese. They're not, and they don't identify, most of them don't identify themselves with China anymore. They're not even communists anymore.
Other questions?
I was in the act of killing, which I've seen. I mean, they're called preman, like the gangsters, or free man. So there's this other sort of interesting link to going back to also the Hollywood movies that they despise, because they also, despite their relations to these American cultural productions, they still took a lot of the stylistics of it. So there's this sort of culture, expression of culture coming from the West, entering into Indonesia, and then a reproduction of that culture that feeds into their own practice. And there's this sort of almost cyclical relationship going on now, which is quite interesting.
Great. Also remember that there's this one scene where the member of Pemuda Pancasila was he was watching Obama's speech, and he was trying to imitate the way Obama speaks, because this guy was going to the town and he was campaigning for some sort of a local political event, okay? And he was imitating the American. Okay? That strong presence of the U.S. in 1965, when they hated the communists because they did not want to watch Hollywood. Up until today, this guy was using Obama as his sort of idol in trying how to express his political expressions and rhetoric. Interestingly, I wasn't able to explain it, but if you cross over to the Philippines, the same robust presence of the U.S. also can be seen in such a way that I think Southeast Asia, in the process of defining ourselves, we somehow always go to the U.S., look at the U.S. and try to compare and contrast. And probably that's necessary, to look at the other, the U.S. as the other, and in the process of looking at the other, we're also defining ourselves. This guy was trying to define himself as a local politician by copying Obama. Filipinos were trying to define ourselves as nationalists by trying to say, well, the Americans were, they betrayed us. They are this, and so we were like this. There's always sort of a binary.
The last question, if it can be very quick.
I think in an interview, Joshua Oppenheimer said that he originally wanted to make a film with the victims, but the victims were too scared to speak. And really watching that, The Act of Killing, I thought was a really grotesque film in many ways. I wonder whether you could comment on what the impact has been on survivors' families.
I don't know.
There's the second movie, the second part of The Act of Killing, The Act of Silence, and this is about the survivors. So the second point of view, like the first one was about the perpetrators, and the second one is about survivors. So,
thank you.
And the second one had a very extensive area in Indonesia. It
Yes.
went out on 500 private cinemas all at once, so it had a very different reception.
And also, like the main character of this movie, he was also present during the screenings, and he was talking about his experience and then like there were also a lot of other events because it was like 50 years after the killing, so there were a lot of other events in Indonesia and the whole discussion going on through media and universities and human rights activists.
So forgive me that it's my job to keep time, so I'm going to charge us forward if I can towards the next panel. Before we move on, can we all join me in thanking Darlene? Let me make sure once again, Thomas Bruce didn't sneak in without me seeing him. You know? I'm going to call up then Ahmed Rizki Umar as our second speaker, who is a MSc candidate in politics at Sheffield University in this country. Yes.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for the opportunity. My name is Umar, and I'm a politics student at the University of Sheffield from Indonesia. My presentation here will be about the changing discourse of sovereignty in Southeast Asia, particularly after the Bandung Conference. So there has been some growing interest among international relations and politics scholars about the Bandung Conference, particularly after 2005, where Indonesia was commemorating the 50 years of the Bandung Conference in Bandung. But the contestation of ideas among the Bandung Conference, I think, has been overlooking a very important concept in the politics and international relations studies. It is the concept of sovereignty. In the joint communique of the Bandung Conference, if we take a look at the documents of the Bandung Conference, it highlights the importance of the rights to self-determination for the newly independent states and the states who were colonized by the European countries at the time. So, in a more theoretical perspective, it will be important to discuss how the concept of sovereignty merged after the Bandung Conference and how it shapes the global politics at the time. So, I would like to use a new perspective that is not belongs to the classical realist approach in international relations studies, which is the historical sociological approach. So in international relations studies, there has been a debate among international relations scholars on how to define the global politics or global political order. The first that has been a mainstream perspective in the 1960s and in the 1970s is the realist perspective that seems to put state as the center of the international relations studies. So according to this perspective, state is defined by its sovereignty over its territory. And the global politics is only constituted by the state. So this is the first perspective that has been the core issue in international relations studies. And the second perspective that I will take in this paper is about the perspective that seems to have a look at the third worldism as a perspective to encounter the hegemony of realist perspective in international relations. So, several international relations scholars, such as Mark Berger, for example, he put the Bandung Conference as a milestone for the third worldist perspective in underpinning the post-colonial state, the emergence of post-colonial state in international relations studies. My point will be different with these two perspectives. I would like to trace how the idea of sovereignty, particularly in Southeast Asia, emerged not only in Bandung Conference, but it is constructed through the historical trajectory of colonialism. So I will divide my presentation into 4 parts. The first part will be about how the idea of post-colonial sovereignty emerged in the colonial era. And the second will discuss the Bandung Conference as globalization of the idea of post-colonial sovereignty in world politics. And the third will discuss about the importance and the stagnation of the idea of post-colonial sovereignty after the Bandung Conference, particularly after the changing political regime in Indonesia in 1965. So if we want to take a look at the Bandung Conference as a milestone for the third World Revival in international relations studies, we have to take a look very seriously at the history of the post-colonial states in Southeast Asia. I argue that during the long historical trajectory of colonialism in Southeast Asia, the idea of sovereignty in post-colonial states is constituted through four features. The first is the practice of colonialism itself. It is since the Spanish and the Portuguese divide Southeast Asia in two parts, according to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 15th century and the Treaty of Zaragoza, that the idea of sovereignty, colonial sovereignty, has been constituted in the region. So at the 16th and the 17th century, there has been two discourse of sovereignty emerged at the time. The first is the colonial discourse of sovereignty that seems to divide the territoriality of Southeast Asia into those who belongs to the colonial forces at the time. But also we have to consider the second discourse that has also been emerged prior to the colonial era. This is the discourse of the so-called traditional discourse of sovereignty, which has been emerged since the 10th or 19th century in the many parts of local country in Southeast Asia. For example, the Majapahit and the Sriwijaya kingdom has defined a very different concept of sovereignty, rather different with the concept those who related to the colonial discourse of sovereignty. These two discourses of sovereignty has been conflated at the time. There has been conflicts, for example, by the resistance from the Diponegoro in Indonesia or resistance from the local sultanate in Malaysia that makes a very dynamic features of sovereignty. But it is in the 18th century that the Dutch and the British has settled the discourse of colonial sovereignty through the introduction of colonial administrative functions. It is at the time the modernity and the modernization process has been constructed in the Southeast Asia through Dutch and British colonial administrative features, and it also constituted the second part of the second features of the sovereignty in Southeast Asia, namely the modernity. And the idea of modernization in Southeast Asia has also emerged. The most important feature, the third important feature in Southeast Asia, that is nationalism. Nationalism is not constructed through a local process, through the localization process in Southeast Asia. It is constructed, in my argument, it's constructed through the dialogue between the so-called Western modernity and the indigenous basis of knowledge that has been produced by the local Indonesian people or Southeast Asian people prior to colonialism. So this is the unique combinations that takes part in Southeast Asia. And the idea of nationalism has emerged, and it embodies as a political movement in the 1920s. And after the Japanese, after the World War II, there has been the embodiment of the post-colonial sovereignty in Southeast Asia. So the idea of post-colonial sovereignty has been constructed through a very dynamic and a very complex processes. So how can we understand Bandung Conference under this historical trajectory? In my arguments, Bandung Conference is not coming from empty space. It has been related to the long trajectory of state building and sovereignty building in Southeast Asia that has been historically constructed since for centuries. And it is the interactions between Sukarno as the political leaders with several other political leaders in Asia and Africa that leads to the embodiment of Bandung Conference. We have to we can trace the historical trajectory of the Bandung Conference through, for example, four other conferences that previously held to prepare the Bandung Conference. For example, in 1947, Jawaharlal Nehru organized ASEAN Relations Conference in Delhi. And in 1949, and as well as in 1954, Sukarno hosts, Indonesia hosts the so-called Bogor Conference that has been the main features of conference to discuss the Asian and African state unity in global politics. The importance of Bandung Conference is, according to my argument, is it is constitute the radicalization of the idea of post-colonial sovereignty in global politics. After the Bandung Conference, at the Bandung Conference, Sukarno and other political leaders in Asia and Africa has discussed the possibility of bringing the colonization of Asian and African states to the world politics. And it embodies in 1960, when the United Nations set up a resolution to start the decolonization process of ASEAN and African states. So after that, after 1955, there has been several attempts, not only by Asian and African countries, but also from the United Nations to decolonize countries. There has, since then, the state of Malaysia, Singapore, and in Africa, there has been so many countries that takes their independence after the Bandung Conference. However, the idea of post-colonial sovereignty as radicalized in Bandung Conference has also been ended in 1960s and 1970s. I will take a look, a particular look in Southeast Asia. The idea of post-colonial sovereignty has been built to the very idea of anti-colonial discourse that is aimed to encounter the two hegemonic political forces at the time, namely the United States and the Soviet Union. But in the 1960s, there has been some political changes in Southeast Asia. For example, in Burma, UNU was toppled down by a series of coups that bring Burma to military junta. And Indonesia, in 1965 and 1966, there has been a political turbulence that brings General Suharto, who is closer to the United States and its allies, to the global politics. It weakens the idea of post-colonial sovereignty that has been radicalized in the Bandung Conference. So, in Southeast Asia as well, we can take a look at the establishment of ASEAN. In my argument, ASEAN is a manifestation of the radicalization of a post-colonial sovereignty that has been constructed by Bandung Conference. In ASEAN, if we take a look at the very basic idea, it is based on the idea of non-interventionism, and it is also based on the idea of maintaining economic operations, maintaining security, that puts the relations of states in Southeast Asia in a more passive approach in the world politics. It is also related to the in 1972 the United Nations has also introduced the new international economic order that has been the most important features of the end of decolonization of the world politics. So in the 1970s and 1980s, there has been a weakened spirit of Bandung Conference, and it is replaced by the idea that the third world states or the newly independent state should be cooperating in a global economy. That in 1980s, it is left to the institutionalization of neoliberal idea that has been brought by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and the world politics. So the idea of Bandung Conference has by then weakened. So after that, in 2015 and also in 2015, where President Yudhoyono and President Jokowi commemorate the idea of Bandung Conference, the spirit is completely different with those who is brought by Sukarno and Gamal Abdel Nasser at the 1955 Bandung Conference. So in this long historical trajectory, we can see that the idea of post-colonial sovereignty has been evolved, and the idea of sovereignty itself is not a single defined discourse. It is evolved through the historical trajectory, and I think it is important for as a conclusion for the international relations scholars to continually assess how the idea of sovereignty is evolved and what discourse of sovereignty that shapes our current trajectory of international relations. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Would you like to field your own questions?
Yeah, if there's any. Sir?
Would you put the Bandung Conference at the end of an historical trajectory or at the beginning of a new one? You can also argue that the meeting in Bandung exemplifies a short period of optimism of new nation states, which was then overrun, overwhelmed by the Cold War, and that it was over. So the rise of authoritarian states, the nature of it, has very little to do with the success of the Bandung Conference, but even more, but more with the failure, ultimate failure. I would see the Bandung Conference as a splendid failure.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, there has been some arguments that mention that Patel and McMichael has argued in that way that Bandung Conference is gateway to authoritarian regimes. However, I would like my argument is it is not in the beginning nor the end, but it is at the middle of the long historical trajectory, because if we take a look at the joint communique of the Bandung Conference, the basic idea of Bandung Conference itself is the respect for human rights and freedom. But it is considered as a normative basis of how to do international relations at the time. After that, some states that has been obtained some benefits from the Bandung Conference, for example, from the idea of decolonization, has also emerged a new discourse of authoritarian regime. And I would not blame only to Bandung Conference at the time, because we cannot see Bandung Conference as only the precursor to the authoritarian regime. The idea of Bandung Conference is built through a very idea that the state, the third colonial, the newly independent state, as the important actor, and it is I agree that because the idea of state centrism in Bandung Conference can lead to the authoritarian regime, but also there has been some possibilities to transform that, and that's why I agree with the idea that the Bandung Conference can lead to the rise of authoritarian regime, but it is not the case in other states. we have to differentiate so many other states in third world countries. I hope that answers your question, sir. Thank you very much.
Your questions.
How well do you think that the whole concept of sovereignty actually travels? I mean, moving from Europe, and there's a sort of growing body of literature on sovereignty as well that criticizes particularly international relations and political science for not defining the term, or not sort of going far enough back into history in terms of how it's evolved, also in the European context, from sort of context where it was about God, king, and subject, and then becoming law, state, and citizen, and that the foundations of sovereignty in Europe itself is quite religious, and it's there's this sort of consecutive theme of the Holy Trinity in a lot of the political science, separation of powers, sovereignty, and a number of other concepts. I'm just wondering if there's have there been any discussions in Indonesia or other Southeast Asian countries on just the concept itself?
Yeah, there has been a discussion about the idea of state in Indonesia, particularly during the 1950s. I think Kevin knows better because it's doing dissertation about that. The idea of Islamic State, for example, has evolved in the 1950s, but it is brought to the end after the 1965 and 1966, where Pancasila has become the hegemonic discourse on doing the politics at the time. But I will address your first question, that how the idea of sovereignty travels from Europe. In my argument, it travels from Europe to it is originally, of course, from the idea of sovereignty in Europe, but it is constructed through the modernization processes in Southeast Asia. In 19th century, I would like to depart from Barry Buzan and George Lawson's argument in this case. The idea of sovereignty that is believed by many third world leaders at the present time is based on the concept of territorial colonial state that is embodied in the 19th century colonial government. It is since the British introduced governmental institutions, and it is since the ethical politics in the Dutch colonial Indonesia that is led to the embodiment of the idea of sovereignty. So I think it's not traveled in the 16th or 17th century, but in my argument, it is in the 19th century that the idea is of sovereignty emerged, and the idea is more secular, not religious. Yeah, thank you.
I think that for the sake of time, we might jump forward to our third speaker, and hopefully this will give us some chance for questions for all of the speakers at the end. Can I invite Casper to step up? As he's doing that, would you join me in thanking Mas Umar? So while he sets up this computer, we have at least one more chair here. If there are any more chairs that we can sneak people into, I hate to make y'all stand throughout the presentation.
Okay, I guess I'm ready.
Please.
Okay, so...
I should introduce our speaker. Forgive me, Kasper Hannes is a PhD candidate in the Department of Theory and Methodology at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, Poland.
So good morning, everyone. So thank you for the introduction. So today I will speak a little bit about more distant past. So basically, in few words, I would like to basically introduce you to the work of my department and our small contribution to the development of landscape archaeology in Asia. So before I start with like the proper presentation, I'd like to speak a little bit like about the few words because some terms, especially for people who are not directly involved in archaeology, could be a little bit misleading. So what is the landscape? So I actually like this example to explain what is the landscape. It's the Thousand Lingas River in Phnom Kulen in Cambodia. So even I got like some short movie. I hope it's gonna work. So basically, this example is a nice way to present the interactions between the human and the environment. So of course there are different theoretical schools in archaeology that perceive landscape in different ways, but for us basically the landscape is very connected with the cognition. So we don't divide, at least like in our work of like myself, my colleagues, we don't divide landscape into the natural landscape and cultural landscape, but in fact for us it's some sort of like two and like the one entanglement entity. So in case of that waterfalls, one could argue that actually it's the natural landscape. However, people made some association with that particular location. What could be seen? Oops, sorry. What could be seen here in this river when we have like this numerous lingas carved into the river's bed. So the question is, how do we reconstruct those past landscapes? And over the last few years we developed a few methods. Mainly we some sort of like extracted the methods from the engineering, mainly from remote sensing and photogrammetrical sciences that allowed us to gain the information that is necessary for us to understand those past landscapes, those past landscapes, the meanings in the landscape that was given by the people, and those modifications that are still visible today. So during this short presentation I will go through a few case studies that we are recently working on in Southeast Asia and beyond, because for example we worked on few sites that basically some sort of like shaped the Southeast Asian culture, even if it's beyond the proper Southeast Asia. So here I just like to show a few glimpses of the methods that we're using. So starting from satellite imaging, we got really into UAV applications, as well as some airborne technologies. In that case, the research in Cambodia with LiDAR technology that was achieved by the international research consortium led by University of Sydney and FEO. And few case studies that I'm gonna talk about. So basically we work with several institutions like Asian-wide. So starting from Cyprus of the very western end of Asia, we've currently two like running projects in Southeast Asia, in Laos and in Cambodia, as well like numerous sites of the in China and Southern Asia, and like as I said, some of the sites had some implications on the shape of Southeast Asia, of today's and past Southeast Asia. So like the first slide that I would like to just basically to present you the methods and methodology and theoretical approaches that we applied is in Kazakhstan. So basically, if we think about the prehistory of Asia in general, we have like this great transmission of ideas, thoughts, as well as products and people over the Silk Road. And in that particular research, we were allowed to think a little bit different about the societies that live along the Silk Road in the prehistory and very early history. So in 2013, the Kazakh enthusiast of history basically identify series of geoglyphs using Google Earth images and show it to local archaeologists. Then the local archaeologists from Kostanay University in northern Kazakhstan approach the colleagues from Cambridge University, who then invited us to collaboration given our expertise, like the staff from Adam Mickiewicz University Department of Theory and Methodology of Prehistory, to give it expertise in the landscape archaeology. So what we can say about those populations just looking in the landscape perspective and how we sense the landscape. So basically the geoglyphs seems to be something of a particular scale. The colleagues from Kazakhstan, with collaboration with Chinese colleagues, were able to get some dates of those constructions using a thermoluminescentical method to reveal that those features were constructed like in the beginning of the first millennium before Christ. And so that really changed the way how we perceive those populations, because those features are like enormous. They could be like 300 meters on the side. So basically, we usually conceptualize those societies as primary tribe nomadic groups roaming around the steppe. But basically, construction of such monumental art, call it architecture, yeah, because they are like made like they're like wooden, they're like soil homes, but with the wooden constructions inside of it, made like a lot of effort that suggests more complicated or stratified society. As well, we use some computer simulations to model the visibility. And the preliminary results, because still we are doing our interpretation, we are still building our narrative, shows that every of the symbol was associated with one particular, for example, river valley of like a piece of landscape. So we suggest we built a narrative saying that those glyphs were some sort of like a landmarks. So every kin group had like, because it's also like the morphology reminds like the shapes of reminds of Tamgas. So every kin group had to one basically stamped the land. Another example how the new technologies basically changed the way how we understand the past Asian landscapes. That's the site in Nepal. It's the site, today's name of the village that is near the site, it's Tilaurakot. However, some people associated with the Kapilavastu, we mentioned Kapilavastu. I'm not going to go into details about the discussion if it's Kapilavastu, if it's not the Kapilavastu. So by the colleagues from University of Durham, we were asked to help them using UAV to prepare the precise maps of the archaeological landscape. Here, the reason to do such research was a little bit different, because basically, as I said, the site is associated with Kapilavastu, what creates a rising tourism and pilgrimage that basically endangered the site, because with like the rise of like parking lots, hotels, and so on, the site itself is endangered. So we are looking at three particular locations, three elements of the archaeological landscape that now is beyond the border of the protected area, but however now UNESCO, because like UNESCO is basically putting the whole project together, is trying to extend the zone. So basically, we found the remnants of the whole moat complex around it, as well as we documented the archaeological landscape inside the protected area. So that's what's here. So to use that, we use a little bit different technology, because in the case of Kazakhstan we have satellite images, and here we use images from the drone. So we created, using UAV, around 60 gigabytes of the aerial images, of our vertical images, that were taken from altitude between 60 to 80 meters, and then using the photogrammetrical software, we just basically stitched them together to create 3D model of the landscape. So for example, here we can see like, so every of those small green boxes is like the one image that then was basically like molten into the landscape, and that's the result. So basically, that's the comparison between Google Earth image and our orthophoto image. So basically, we achieved the accuracy below 10 centimeters. What's incomparable to few meters pixel on the available satellite images from Google Earth is like really change the accuracy in which we can create archaeological maps. Moreover, the whole image is three-dimensional. So that's digital elevation model made with the same kind of data. When we can clearly see, for example, here the remnants of the moat, something that could be seen as some sort of rampart, then here the colleagues from Durham identified prior to our research, but however we sort of confirmed it, the presence of like additional mounds that have archaeological material in it. As we have like some spare time at the end of our mission in February 2015, we did some additional flights over the side of Aurora Cod. When the same we did the orthophoto map and the digital elevation model, and digital elevation model clearly shows us the double moat on the eastern side of the site as well as like the rising platform. So that's like example. So that's another case study. China, maybe not directly connected with Southeast Asia, but still I think worth mentioning because that's the method developed for studies of the past European landscape that we applied in Asia, and it's like one of the, as far as I know, first applications when we use the satellite image, archival satellite images. So basically, the site is called Miran, is one of the cities along the Silk Road, where we use basically the landscape that is presented here is mostly gone. Because of the extension of the model farming, that part of the site is basically covered with the modern fields. So using the CIA spy satellite images from the 60s and 70s, for example, this particular image was taken in 1968. We are able to reconstruct, to sense the landscape that it's already gone. Oh, for example, here for comparison, we have some, you can see the contemporary satellite image with the structures that are already gone, or they are like gone because we know them from the satellite image from the 60s, or they are very, very endangered. Oh, that's gonna be one of my favorite, like recent ones. So here we don't have that much data yet because basically we did this study just in February this year, so we are just from the field. When we combined the applications of mobile GIS with the drone to do the research on the plain of jars in northern Laos. So basically we made like some sort of fancy movie to show to the people basically what we are now researching. So maybe I'll just go a little bit. There we go. Yeah, so basically, as you can see, we are using, so we have the plain of Jar decided that it's now applying to be listed on UNESCO World Heritage List. So the site was heavily bombed. You can see all the craters done by Americans during the second Indo-China War. So we find the UAV as the best method for quick mapping, because basically the problem is that we have limited funding, limited time. We have to do those maps. We don't have time to basically go and do the proper measurements from the ground. So the same, using the technology of the photogrammetry, we are able to document this piece of landscape in relatively short time, because basically to prospect, I don't know how many of you have been to the site, but like it's quite big site. It's Jar Site 1, just next to the Ponsonvan Airport. So it's at the block of landscape, like a little bit more by 2 kilometers, and we actually were able to prospect this landscape just with the 1 day, plus around 7 days of post-processing, but already in the lab back in Poland. So it wasn't that time consuming, but this research was supplemented because of course we got the UAV, but still there is some sort of information we need to sense on the ground. So that's myself and few of my students from Adam Mickiewicz University, with whom we using the mobile GIS technologies, like so we have like this big fancy antenna that allows us to take the records like within 10 centimeters accuracy. We created the database that consists the information about the jars, like size, depth, capacity, like the cavity diameter, stone, like slabs or discs associated. Yeah, and that's my favorite. So like the last but not least, the work I've been doing since 2010 in Cambodia with the great help of the people from the University of Sydney. When first I started to work with the remote sensing data during this like great LiDAR mission. So basically LiDAR is the technology using laser beam allows us to scan below the tree canopies, and that really changed the way how we perceived the past cityscape. So this image here presents the actual tree coverage. So as you can see, the most of the side of Angkor, like central Angkor, is covered by the trees. Then this map presents our state of knowledge prior to the LiDAR mission and after the LiDAR mission. I see that I have to go into like very quick conclusions, but still with like another way how we utilize the images, like the technologies of the landscape prospection in Cambodia, is that we basically made the comprehensive map of the prehistoric and early historic sites in the whole Siem Reap region, developing of the method of identifying the anthropogenic modifications in the landscape to see how the past populations interact. So going like to very quick conclusions, that's you'd be interested. So that's one of the sites in Nepal. It's like the 1st century Buddhist shrine that basically seen is the raw point cloud during our scanning mission. So like as I said, my presentation didn't have form of this sort of like narrative, or I wasn't mentioning any particular research problem, but rather I wanted to basically point out the rising group of the archaeologists working on the past landscapes, and show you basically which technologies now we use to perceive those landscapes, as well as present how we can transform this data into historical narratives. Because that, at least what I feel when I go, for example, to some conferences of archaeological remote sensing, that getting the nice map is all the people need. And I hope that here I presented how somehow we can transfer it into something that goes beyond. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I would be very happy to answer.
Questions and responses?
Thanks for the presentation, which I found really interesting. I'm just wondering, what do you think about this sort of field of study in the future? Do you think in a couple of years from now there'll be some sort of dialogue between archaeologists, people from other disciplines, and if so, which ones? How do you envision this? Because you're sort of in the center of the action.
I mean, basically, there are like two fields. So basically, we are getting better and better in case of utilizing the technologies. So we definitely have to do more dialogue with the engineers and so on. But that's not the problem, because also engineers are usually into that. But I feel like, as I said, I feel the lag with the working with that technologies, like with the people who actually do the interpretation. Because maybe it's not that the problem is not that vivid in Asian studies, but for example in Europe, 95% of archaeological research in Europe is some sort of like a commercial archaeology, like consultant archaeology, rescue archaeology for investment like highways, factories, etc. And those people, so they create 95% of like data, or basically they excavate 95% of the sites. However, they have to be cost effective because they're private companies. So they don't use those technologies at all. On the other hand, for example, the archaeologists themselves, like academic archaeologists, like research archaeologists themselves, they don't use that data as much. So even, for example, just showing the Polish example, or even the British example, I mean, I don't know how many universities that you have in UK that have the faculty or like department of archaeology, but I know maybe 4 or 5 here in UK that actually utilize or have like separate lab doing the remote sensing in archaeology, like even in Poland. Poland is like quite a big country, like I guess like 30% bigger than UK in case of the territory, and still we have just 2 facilities. So it's like my department in Poznań and one laboratory at the University of Warsaw that uses new technologies. So I would say that there is a group of archaeologists that talk a lot to the engineers. However, before we start to talk, for example, to historians, etc., we have to talk to another archaeologist to basically go beyond this some sort of like ivory tower that now we see and spread the technology. So, for example, one of the projects that now we are running with the cooperation with the Warsaw University of Technology, we try to create some sort of like low-cost solutions for the mapping using UAV. So basically, we are trying to make the UAV with the software package that would be like less expensive than $1,000. That would allow everyone to basically have like this robust, user-friendly system to do archaeological mapping. So we are aware of that problem, and we are trying to implement the solution so the bigger and bigger group of the archaeologists could take advantage of that like technological breakthroughs. Maybe in the back.
What happens when your technology, which is obviously transforming the world of interpretation of archaeology, meets with politics? I take the case of Majapai. Yeah? We know from the Archiv-Dienst, which did the excavations, that Majapai was actually a very small port city. It had a circumference of about 2.7 kilometers for its capital, and about 7.2 for the royal city itself. And this is at variance very much with what Indonesians have traditionally thought Majapahit was. And there's also the whole issue of whether Majapahit was a Southeast Asian Venice, crisscrossed by canals. And there's no physical, in terms of physics, geophysics, it's an impossibility because there were no bodies of water. It actually rises to 34 meters, so that it's very difficult to conceive of some major canal system being in place. And yet the interpretation of aerial evidence, which is from KLM photographs, is that the Pait, which are the various ditches which were along the Rajamarga, are in fact canals. So your evidence, if you were allowed to do a survey of Majapai, would be completely at widditions with what the received wisdom is about what that royal city was like.
I mean, I don't know this case that well because basically I haven't been working on like insular Southeast Asia. However, like I mean, I perceive that still is the way of creating the narratives. So even I'm not saying that in general, like the archaeological philosophy, besides my research, basically neglect the true at all. So basically, I'm just saying that I'm creating another narrative. But I can imagine that, for example, preparing such a 3D model of the landscape could give you some like additional like scientific evidence. So basically, that for example, in case Vancouver, that's colleagues from Sydney, who on the case of Phnom Penh, Koker, are creating a new narratives using the 3D-dimensional data to basically run some sort of the hydrological documentation. However, still it's not complete, because I mean we have to remember that what we are seeing now, what we are sensing, also it was subjected to the transformation after it was used. So even, for example, I did personally the research that was published a few months ago in Archaeological Prospection about the water cisterns in Angkor. And basically there are like so many processes after after the usage of that system in during the most of the post-medieval times. So now just looking at the remote sensing data in that particular place is not enough. So we had to do some additional research to basically properly understand the operations of that system, and I'm pretty sure that even if some new evidence come into being, we're gonna be really surprised. So I guess it could contribute to the discussion, but still, I mean, there always can be some additional source of data that may gonna change our point of view.
With our last few minutes, maybe I can call up our two previous speakers, and we'll open it up for questions to anyone, or questions that compare between the talks. Please. One of the questions that I actually have for all of you is the way that this sort of historical material is presented to the public. I think in films that's very clear. In archaeology, it's constantly presented to the public, but not in very clear ways. Bandung, similarly, it's not, transparent how we're going about using this. What do you see about the way that this historical information is presented to the public, and why that becomes important?
Oh, I thought you just mentioned that in films, really, it's quite obvious. Yeah, you go and you watch, and that thing that before wasn't quite clear to you, you got some questions, becomes even more apparent. But then your questions are answered, and then the movie itself creates more questions, thus pushing the discourse a little bit further. And really that's where my argument was really anchored, that films provide not exactly answers, but really platforms for illuminating various facets of the past that may not be known to really the majority of contemporary Southeast Asian society.
I mean, again, I'm gonna go from my point of view, not point of view of the archaeologists in general, but the same. I think that applying those photogrammetric technologies could make the archaeological narratives much more approachable. Because basically, even this short clip that I present you during of the Plain of Jars, actually it was made to be presented for some groups of non-specialists to basically catch their attention. So with the technology, we are able to present the narratives in the much more vivid form. So we can create the 3D models that could just shuffle around. Even, for example, there are two laboratories now, one in States and one in France, that is utilizing this virtual reality technology. It's the company is called Oculus, but they create this sort of googles, and they are making some sort of first attempts. So the guys in States are doing the reconstruction of the Roman temple in France. So I think that also so beyond the research applications of the new technologies, also we have this whole group of something that's in general it's called the digital humanities. So the way to make this sort of data much more approachable, and the same. I mean especially now when we have the next generation, that what we call is digital native. So basically they're raised with the whole electronic devices and so on. For them, these sort of virtual museums may be much more natural than the empirical presence of the objects in the beyond the glass. so yeah, I think that's actually something that I'm very happy about. That can basically bring the archaeology to the wider audience.
Yeah, in the conference, the most important document, historical material is the archive. My colleague in Leiden has been doing some research about this, and he's using some materials in Archive Nasional in Indonesia. Most of the materials come from the Archive Nasional in Indonesia, and also the Asian and African Museum in Bandung. But still, I haven't done further research about this material. I will do this for my dissertation project, but there are several writings. For example, by Ruslan Abdul Ghani, that is the Secretary General of the Bandung Conference, is not open for general public. Yeah, several people have the document, but it's not open for the general public. But also the challenge, other than doing the historical research in Indonesia, is also finding some archive in other countries. There are several other countries than Indonesia that is involved in the Bandung Conference. In Myanmar, for example, I'm not sure there is public material that can be accessed by academics in that country, or as well as in several African countries. And I think it will be the challenge for the researcher in this field.
Other questions?
Thank you, Kevin. My name is Faris from Woodrow University. I would like to ask Dani, films and cinemas, in my opinion, are not only a product of a culture yet, it's also a product of capitalism and sometimes a political project. In countries, developed countries like United States, for example, I think Hollywood represents the development of capitalism in a good way. But in countries like Southeast Asia, where the country is struggling with identity, conflict, and so ever, films also represented the interests of particular groups. For example, during the New Order period, these are films that portray how communism is an evil for the whole people. In my opinion, it was how the New Order tried to shape the history through films, and also in terms of how capitalism served particular people. In this case, I think the elites of Indonesian politicians. Do you find these two films in your case studies also sort of influenced by sort of interests? Thanks.
I would answer that by saying I did not consider that question in analyzing and examining these two films. But then I will also add that in my doctoral dissertation, what you're saying is exactly what I'm doing. I'm using, so this is, as I have mentioned, this is only an offshoot of my primary research, which is, I study Southeast Asian films from Indonesia, Philippines, and Malaysia during the Cold War, 1945 to 1967, and see how films intersect with nation building, decolonization, and Cold War. And you're correct. Films have been used by business elites and also really political leaders in constructing the nation. Okay? So we have that crucial role of films as entertainment products, but also really ideological and political products to help build an imagined nation. And yet, even if it's imagined, it was necessary from 1945 onwards, because it was a time of the nationalist projects coming out in Southeast Asia. I can talk more about that. I don't have time.
We are tight on time. Let me give the last question to Dr.
Yes. it's about the title of this panel that still puzzles me. The first part of history always wins. I like that. I don't know what it means, and I don't know what kind of history wins. But then the second part is how the past shapes. It's not even a question whether the past shapes the present in Southeast Asia. It assumes that that is apparently the case. It's only a matter of how it shapes. Do you feel that you have addressed this question, or is it basically irrelevant to what you keep telling us?
I will say, please don't put on any of them the title of the panel. I think that's come from the conference. So,
okay.
This is a question that is worth asking, and we have some good experts on it. But I don't think any of them put that title up.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. No, go.
The Bandung papers seem to suggest a little bit like that. There's a long trajectory, there's a long delay,
Yeah, I think it depends on our conceptualization of history. In my perspective, history is not only belong that the past that constitutes the present, but it is a continuous process. And the past constitutes the present, but what is it also constitutes our future, and we have to see this as a continual process. So I think that's my take for the title.
Yeah, like even from the same from my perspective, I'm like the landscape usually is conceptualized as palimpsest. So basically, I mean by looking for like the old remnants in the present palimpsest of the landscape. Also, we have to understand better the modern world that surrounds us. So I guess that's how the past like shaped the present.
I'll answer that very, very quickly. In the act of killing, one of the members of the killing squad said, "We were the victors of the war. We won." So we determined the narrative. And towards the end, it was really true. The one was the one that was highlighted in the film. The victim, there was one scene where the victim was trying to incorporate his father's own story in the film that the guys were making. And the members of the killing squad said, "We have no place for that." So indeed, history wins. The history of the victors win.
What a note to end on. We still have plenty of time for conversation. Your next stop is to get coffee, and please do enjoy that back out in the hall. But be sure to get a seat by 11 o'clock so that we can start our plenary session.
Just get like a very last word. I mean, if for like all of you who are interested like into like the structure archaeological things, we organize in Poznan in summer next year the Congress of European Association of Southeast Asian Archaeologists. So I'm just like really happy to see all of you there. Thank you.
Sure. So now you have an opportunity to speak with our speakers, but please do join me in thanking them.